little bit to the science business, there are two types of evidence, because we're saying that وَالدَّلِيلُ خَلْقُ الْكَائِنَاتِ. We're saying that how we arrived at knowledge of God was through looking at the creation. Well, how do you do that? Because scientists will tell you that there's nothing here about God, don't bring up anything about intelligent design, don't do this, don't do that. First, we have to discuss what this, وَالدَّلِيلُ خَلْقُ الْكَائِنَاتِ. The evidence, the proof, is in the created things. So we have to discuss what evidence means, because there's a qaida, there is a rule that we've discussed before, which is, it's a rule that you need to keep. It's a rule in usul, but it's a rule that you need to keep up with everything. And it is الحكم على الشيء فرع عن تصوره. The judgment on anything stems from a conceptualization of it. So when we say وَالدَّلِيلُ, the evidence, what are we talking about here? There are two types of evidence typically that you might find in the books of philosophy of science and whatnot. And these two types of evidence are material evidence and inferred evidence. The material evidence is the hard data, the facts that stand alone without any interpretation. You don't have to be a specialist to see them. They're available for anyone to look at them. And if you do the same sequence of actions that generated them in the first place in a particular experiment in the lab, you will regenerate that material evidence again. Sometimes the material evidence is just out there in nature, and all you have to do is look around and observe it, right? This idea of how do we know the age of the earth, for example, or the age of something? Carbon dating. How do you know that a skeleton that was found is X number of years, and this other skeleton found in the same area is actually older than it by 50,000 years? Various things. The simplest one that I can tell you right now is you can do carbon dating and look at fossilized precipitation of minerals into and out of the bones, and you can actually calculate accurately within a very narrow range how old each skeleton was. That's in addition to where on the which layer on the earth layers that you found the skeleton in. So there's a lot of different things that you can do. And that's not inferred. This is hard evidence, material evidence that you could just look at and go this is, if I tell you that something is black and you look at it, no two people will disagree that it's that color, right? They might disagree on the language and that they describe it in, but it's one color. Both of them see it that way. Maybe variation, maybe that's a bad example because women can see different wavelengths. But anyways, you get the point. That's material evidence. Something is a square, it's a square. Something is a circle, it's a circle. If you come to the lab and you're not a specialist in my field and just follow the protocol of something that I do and mimic exactly what I did, you will generate the same type of information that I had generated. That is material evidence. Inferred evidence, on the other hand, is the explanation that is imposed upon the material evidence. This is where we get subjective now. It's the subjective interpretation the individual gives for the facts presented. And it relies on identification of patterns and inferences to similar patterns and logical validity. Now, the simpler, and this is just another rule, it's Occam's razor, it's called. The simpler and more direct, meaning the less steps required to explain something, the more likely that interpretation will coincide with the underlying reality behind the material evidence. Now, science itself, when you hear atheists talk about the evidence, they're speaking about, typically, usually what they talk about is this combination of the two. But you have to actually separate them and deal with them individually. Science is not just the data. To just show me a bunch of numbers, that's not science. Any monkey can show you these data. That's not science. Science is the data plus the most plausible interpretation. Now, this sets a limit for it because there is a point where one can go too far from the data, and at that point, it will no longer be science. And right now, if you look at, there is a funny article. This guy he felt like a polemicist when I was reading his article, and he was complaining to no end about the current rise of popular brain books, which rely on all these findings that we've been coming up with in different MRI studies and whatnot, and just go your brain on this and your brain on that. I mean, I personally have a website for that, and but he's more bugged by the current rise of this. It's a bunch of journalists that wrote these books that went through some science papers, and they induced from it, inductive kind of repercussions from the findings in these studies, and they go like, now you can do all of this stuff with this knowledge about the brain. That's a point where science might be like it can actually become anti-science, because now you're undermining the whole scientific establishment. And so that's what I'm saying. You got two types of evidences: the material and the inferred, and you have to separate between the two and then examine each one. The material evidence, like I said, you can regenerate it if you follow the same protocol, and those that lie, like this Korean scientist a few years ago, in South Korea, there was this race for generating stem cells by reversing the genetic clock, the genetic mechanisms for skin cells, I think it was at the time, where they took skin cells and reversed their timeline and got them back to their stem cells like state. And this Korean scientist, South Korean scientist, basically forged the data. Forging the data in the scientific community is the fastest thing to get exposed. And this man actually lost his job and shamed himself and his whole country for what he did, because initially people thought like, wow, what an amazing finding. So that's the material data. The inferred evidence, that's where you start linking things. And actually, there's two levels of this that you may not find readily described. There is the inferred evidence, which is just linking up those sequence, this data in a logical order. And then there is the induction from that to hypothesize and come up with theories. And as I mentioned before at some point, and I wrote about this as well, Einstein said that, it's the theory that determines what we observe. And that's something that was reiterated also by Thomas Kuhn, who talked about theory-laden data. If you come in with a particular theory, you design your experiment in a particular way, that hard data now that you generate actually end up confirming that theory that you came up with. So there's actually two different approaches in science. There is the one approach which we don't know what's going to happen, we're just going to do this, and whatever comes up, comes up. And there's the second approach of we're going to come in with a particular theory, with an idea in mind, and so we will design the experiment that way, and we will generate the data that way, and then the data will be interpreted based on statistical programs and statistical systems and methods that are also chosen based on how many variables do we have in there, and also based on what we expected. And so this is like more upper level statistics that you can do with that. And so science is not this simple thing that is being presented by people to just like, okay, it is what it is and that's it, and it's just so direct. It's not that direct. It's very complex, and there's a lot of almost like positive reinforcement feedback mechanisms built into the system to reconfirm things that sometimes may not even be true. And so that's the idea behind that. Now, for a Muslim, what you need to understand is you need to really master this field properly before issuing any judgment on it. And, like I said, this judgment on anything stems from conceptualizing it, because a wrong judgment will generate an invalid a wrong conceptualization will generate an invalid judgment.